There's a saying down there, small town, big hell.
People were actually even yelling, "Bring out the gringo because we're going to kill him."
He was an American making a name for himself in a tropical paradise. He never saw it coming. A girl raped and murdered. The crime was horrific. And then the police came after him.
He said, "I have some terrible news to tell you about Eric."
Her son, a stranger in a strange land, and he thought he was at home until he was accused of murder.
It was an angry mob of people that weren't interested in justice, but revenge.
Did he do it or not? Did it matter?
Being locked up here, it's like being buried alive.
And his greatest hope was her. Hello, I'm Tamron Hall. Welcome to Dateline on OWN. It's the story of a young American accused of a crime that would enrage a nation. He'd staked his future on a place far from home and felt a special bond with the people there. But in a flash, he became a monster in their eyes. Then his dreams centered on one thing, getting out alive. Here's Keith Morrison.
This case is so disturbing on so many levels. One thing I'll never be able to get out of my mind are the pictures of the crime scene. Whoever killed her, what they did to her. I mean, it was just a brutal crime.
She was a jewel set in a Nicaraguan paradise, just 25, strikingly beautiful, bright, ambitious. What was done to her was horrific. The crime scene photographs show her body trussed up like some animal and left as if on display here on the floor of her little clothing shop by the beach. Oh, and one more thing. She had been seeing an American. Another American, writer Tony D'Souza, set out to investigate the crime and became a witness to a national tidal wave of anger.
It was a major event here. I've heard it, compared to the O.J. Simpson trial.
Only this case would go against the young American who dipped his toes into sleepy seaside life here and found himself caught up in a story of jealousy, injustice, and a murder so twisted it united this nation in outrage and revenge.
It was a cultural tinderbox, and there's a saying down there, small town, big hell.
Eric Volz was the young man destined to walk into that small town hell. He'd grown up in San Diego, ambitious, competitive, even driven, and an eager student of Latin America. And in 2005, after backpacking around Central America, he responded to a friend's invitation to Nicaragua.
Nicaragua is a very special place, and it's in a tremendous time of development.
One of the uncut diamonds on this Pacific coastline is the sparkling seaside town Eric soon called home, San Juan del Sur.
San Juan del Sur is very enchanting. It has a very sleepy, feeling to it. Everyone's extremely nice there, nice people.
But it wasn't just the sweet, sunny people and the surfing Eric liked. He was catching a big wave of change here.
The image is evolving into more of a new hotspot for travelers and baby boomers that want to have, retirement homes.
More rock climber than social climber, Eric surprised himself by stepping onto a career ladder, making big commissions with the franchise of Century 21, selling real estate.
There's a lot of capital, cash flow coming into Nicaragua, businesses popping up.
But the waves of dollars washing up on these shores brought friction too, a reminder of old American hostilities in Nicaragua. Resentments building up?
Yeah, of course. As locals start to realize that they're kind of being left behind, they retaliate. Crime goes up, drug use goes up, delinquencies. And it's been starting to get worse in San Juan.
Maybe he should have seen the trouble headed his way. Maybe he wasn't looking. As 2005 came around, everything was just as good as it could be for any 20-something American adventurer. And then it got even better when Eric started dating a local waitress.
I met Doris in a restaurant that actually was just down the street from where I worked. And luckily they had the best food in town, so I went there quite often.
What was she like?
Incredibly beautiful, very charismatic.
Couldn't help but notice her.
Oh yeah. What was unique about her is that she was very kind of independent. She supported herself financially. She was putting herself through college.
How did you manage to, make her notice you?
I just got to know her over time, and eventually developed more of a formal relationship as boyfriend and girlfriend.
Doris had grown up in a poor family, as many in Nicaragua do. And it's a tradition of necessity here. She lived with an aunt and cousins in a small, cramped house, while her mother worked and sent money home from her job in Nicaragua's capital, Managua. Before long, Doris had moved in with Eric, a temporary arrangement, at least as far as he was concerned.
I knew that I wouldn't be in Nicaragua forever. I was very careful not to lead her on. I wasn't going to marry her.
You told her that?
Oh, yeah, of course. I tried to be very responsible and very upfront.
She would have married you if you'd asked?
Yeah, definitely.
And why not? He was good-looking, young, and very successful. Now he was publishing an innovative magazine about responsible foreign investment in Nicaragua. He called it El Puente, meaning the bridge. He told his mom Maggie back in Nashville, Tennessee, it was designed to span the divide between locals and Americans.
The plan was to continually develop his magazine, that he wanted to develop it so it could affect all of Central America. He was very passionate about his magazine.
And Eric's success was perhaps what encouraged Doris to set up her own business, a fashion boutique on one of San Juan's busier streets.
I helped her do a business plan, and she made money, and she ran the place by herself, and she was a great salesperson.
She was going places.
She really wanted to break out and, obtain more mobility for herself.
And with that mobility, that breaking out of small-town life, her relationship with Eric, local tongues started wagging.
There was a lot of people that really envied Doris. The big rumor was that, Eric must be the one behind the scenes. He must be the one that's paying for the store.
That was the nasty chatter of people who were envious of her beauty and her success.
Yeah, definitely. And of her boyfriend. There was a lot of people that were envious of the fact that she, was dating me.
It was almost a year after they'd started dating. Eric's magazine was taking off. It was time, he decided, to move El Puente to the capital, Managua, a 2.5-hour drive from tiny San Juan. 2.5 hours from Doris.
Was there a discussion, or did she ever consider moving to Managua with you?
No, never.
So what happened to the relationship?
Well, we remained friends, good friends. I remained supportive. We saw each other on occasion.
But Doris started seeing someone else.
Did she tell you at the time?
She told me about him once. Told me that she had met a guy who was treating her very nicely, and he loved her.
He loved her?
That's what she told me.
What Doris may not have told Eric was her belief that there was an intruder lurking around, someone she thought was spying on her. The last time Eric Vogt says he saw Doris was November 2006 in San Juan. He says they spent the night together and had breakfast the following morning.
Wasn't a final goodbye, it was just see you, but I don't know when? Or?
Oh, yeah.
So now the young publisher, Eric Volz, was about to turn a page in his life. He had essentially said goodbye to his girlfriend, Doris. He was also going to say goodbye to Nicaragua, at least as a permanent residence. After some meetings and a visit with his grandmother in California, he intended to move the magazine to Costa Rica. And it was one of his last meetings in Managua when the telephone rang.
One of Doris's friends was calling.
Coming up.
She was bawling and crying and screaming, and then, I knew that something was happening.
When Murder by the Sea continues. Welcome back to Murder by the Sea. A young American adventurer in paradise, bright, successful, and lucky in love. But as he planned to say goodbye to a country he adored, his life would forever be changed by a devastating phone call. Here's Keith Morrison.
The tears start to pour, and, how can this be? And it rocks you to the reality that you live in.
Eric had been preparing to move his magazine from Nicaragua to Costa Rica. But when he got that call, he says, he told his colleagues he wouldn't be leaving quite so soon after all. He rented a car in Nicaragua's capital, Managua, and 3 hours later he encountered the dreadful scene in tiny San Juan. Doris, dead, in the back room of her fashion boutique.
The police, they had the door open. People could kind of see in the back and see, maybe her feet in the back of the store. And for decency, I was like, man, can't you at least shut the door?
Eric says he was told to stand on the street where a hushed crowd had gathered.
It was a really ominous mood. And then I could see over the heads of the people this little blue storefront. And the police were coming in and out of it.
Tony D'Souza is a young writer from Chicago. He'd been enjoying some downtime after completing an award-winning novel when, quite suddenly, this bizarre story began to unfold right in front of him.
I said to a guy right next to me, I said, you know, what happened? And he said, a girl raped and murdered.
Inside was the stuff of nightmares. The store up front had been ransacked and robbed. Signs of a struggle led back through a living area and into the bedroom, where police found the body. Doris had apparently been raped brutally and strangled, and her body hogtied and exposed. And her attacker or attackers didn't even stop there.
They smelled so full of paper and rags that when they took that stuff out of her mouth and took pictures of her, it looked to me like her, her jaw had been broken. I mean, it was just a brutal crime.
Eric began to think about funeral arrangements. He says he felt compelled to help. He found himself involved in the family's decision-making. At the time, it seemed to some of Doris's family that Eric was being a little pushy. After all, nobody invited him to be there. But Eric was into it now. He'd become a kind of amateur detective. The day after Doris was found murdered, Eric says, he discovered the police arrested 2 local men. And he knew them from the beach, 2 surfers named Julio Martin Chamorro and Nelson Dangla.
It's such a small town that if you asked who were the 2 most delinquent people, they would name these 2 people. And San Juan people did it. They've said, on record, we're not even surprised that it was Nelson and Julio Chamorro. That was the only thing they hadn't done, is killed somebody.
But why would they have murdered Doris? Eric continued his detective work, hoping to help the police solve the crime, he claims. He went to see the chief investigating officer, a strategy that was about to backfire.
He stops me in the middle of our conversation, and he tells me, Eric, you drink a lot, don't you? Do you get violent when you drink, Eric? And then he continued by saying, you're a jealous guy. Would you kill somebody if if they cheated on you?
Eric says he was outraged by the policeman's accusations.
And I said, I don't like your tone. I know my rights, and you're speaking to me in an accusatory way.
He was also accusing you of murder.
Well, he didn't directly do it, but he was accusing me of somehow, his tone. It was his tone.
Implying.
Yeah.
Later the same day, 2 days after Doris was murdered, it was time to bury her. Eric stepped in to help carry the coffin of his former girlfriend. He had no idea, of course, that this stint as a pallbearer would come back to haunt him. He was upset, he says, distraught.
What effect did it have on you?
I went through a lot of pain, no answers, just that knot that you get in your stomach when you lose somebody, and definitely a lot of tears, a lot of sorrow.
His mourning was short-lived. Just after the funeral, that very day, they came for him. It was, he says, a complete surprise. A man in San Juan called Eric's mom, Maggie, back in Nashville.
He said, you need to excuse yourself and you need to find a quiet place because I have some terrible news to tell you about Eric. And I didn't know.
What did you think?
I didn't know what to think at that moment.
Eric had been arrested for the rape and murder of Doris Jimenez.
I was just in shock. I felt sick to my stomach. I felt like I was just going to throw up the whole time.
It was the day your life changed.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's never been the same since. Probably never will be either. It's devastating.
Eric was taken to a Nicaraguan jail to wait for his trial, and he says he was terrified.
All of a sudden, my life was being threatened, and I was in prison with killers and, violent criminals.
Tony D'Souza, the writer, saw a story breaking. He was on a loose contract with Outside Magazine. He called his editor.
I just knew it was going to be a big story. Because he was a U.S. citizen, a white guy, accused of killing a Nicaraguan girl.
The local press jumped all over it, or rather, all over Eric.
You were said to be arrogant, wealthy, arrogant, spoiled. American kid who felt he could, kill with impunity a lovely local girl.
It was surreal for me to see the way that they were presenting me nationally.
In his only TV interview in prison, Eric says they presented him as a brutal killer. But was he? On December 7th, regional court was assembled here in Rivas, the provincial capital. A local judge prepared to hear the case. And outside, a crowd began to gather in the streets around the courthouse. And soon the crowd was huge and menacing. They were demanding Eric's head.
They were yelling.
The judge, after hearing Eric's defense, eased his pretrial imprisonment to house arrest. The crowd, waiting, heard this and was furious. Eric Voltz was led out of the courtroom. And what came next was truly terrifying.
Coming up.
They had a machete or a club or a gun and were trying to kill him.
When Murder by the Sea continues. Welcome back to Dateline on OWN. When a beautiful young woman is found brutally murdered in a seaside town in Nicaragua, authorities turn to her ex-boyfriend, a handsome and successful American with big dreams. The crime so violent and horrific triggers widespread anger. And for the man who stands accused, the nightmare has only just begun. Here's Keith Morrison.
In Nicaragua, public rage was growing over the murder of Doris Jimenez. It was directed at the young American, Eric Voltz, and it wasn't hard to see why. Headlines in a leading tabloid almost shouted the accusation that Voltz had brutally raped and murdered his ex-girlfriend, Doris. This, as American writer Tony D'Souza was getting his teeth into the story for Outside Magazine.
Guilty. Why?
The vast majority of people, local and expat, were sure he was guilty.
And perhaps guilty enough to try to influence Doris's mom, Mercedes.
There's a story that she was offered $1 million to make the case go away.
That is one that has a lot of legs to it.
Somebody did offer her that kind of money?
Something happened. I don't think it was Eric's family, anyone on Eric's legal side.
Doris's mother denies receiving money from anybody. But she ensured that the story of an attempted bribe went very public.
It's a major part of how public sentiment was turned against Eric, trying to buy his way out of a crime in Nicaragua.
And when Eric began to appear in court to face rape and murder charges, Doris's mother, Mercedes, was ready. She assembled a huge crowd outside the courthouse. At a pretrial hearing in December, says Tony D'Souza, that crowd became a mob.
There were people, though, with machetes, guns, clubs?
What I'm sure of is that it was a big, angry mob, and that some people in that mob would have killed Eric Voltz if they had had a chance to get their hands on him.
Could you hear them?
Sure.
Yelling? Yelling what?
Bring out the gringo because we're going to kill him. It was an angry mob of people that weren't interested in justice, but revenge.
After his hearing, Eric, in his prison-issue garb, was led from the courthouse and into the mouth of the mob.
What happened after that was me running for my life from hundreds of people.
They were chasing you?
Yeah. I was handcuffed, no shoelaces, and my pants were falling down because the jeans they brought me were too big.
U.S. Consul General Mark Mesner says an embassy officer was also caught up.
One of the embassy officers that was with him was also attacked by the mob. I mean, they really had to run for their lives.
Even so, Eric managed to escape. He took refuge in a nearby gymnasium.
I found some rope in the office and tied my shoes up. There was a soft measuring tape, and I cut it with a fork and made a belt. I wet my hand with saliva and actually tore the handcuff off my left hand and took some flesh with it.
What were you thinking?
It was, an adrenaline-filled, near-death experience.
Eventually, Eric found some police who took him back to prison. He had barely escaped street justice, so it seemed a wise choice to opt for a single judge only and no jury. About 3 months after his arrest, Eric was put on trial, along with Julio Chamorro, who police said was an accomplice to the murder. Local prosecutor Isolde Ibarra charged that Eric murdered Doris, most likely in a fit of jealous rage, after discovering she was dating another man, an opinion supported by Doris's mother, Mercedes.
Doris told me she was scared that his jealousy would drive him to kill her.
The prosecutor called upon Doris's friends and relatives, like her cousin, Ada, who claimed Eric was so controlling. Doris found herself trying to escape.
She tried to leave him. I think she left him, and that's when the problems began.
Ada also believed the mystery intruder Doris had worried about was a jealous Eric checking up on Doris. Ada said she last saw Doris at 9 a.m., the day she was murdered, as Doris was leaving for work.
She got dressed, she came into the room, kissed the baby, and said, "I'll see you later."
4 hours later, Doris was dead. And it wasn't long before Eric was fingered as a suspect by the prosecutor.
We have testimony that places him directly at the scene when the crime was committed.
Investigators determined Doris was murdered in broad daylight just after midday, around 12:30 p.m. And the prosecutor's prime witness testified in court that he saw Eric right then near Doris's store.
He says that at 10 a.m., Eric showed up in a low white car.
That Eric paid him to carry 2 bags of clothes to the car.
And then Eric got in the car, and they drove away in the direction of Managua.
Then the prosecutor presented strong physical evidence, incriminating stuff. There were photos showing scratches on Eric's back, caused, said the prosecutor, by Doris's fingernails in a desperate fight for her life.
Forensic tests show they corresponded to self-defense injuries by the victim.
And that wasn't all.
The forensic doctor took a sample from under Eric's nails and found blood there.
Must have been Doris's blood, she said. And in trying to avoid punishment for his crime, said the prosecutor, Eric spun the lie that he'd ordered a rental car after hearing Doris was dead, but was caught by a different timeline given by the rental car company, whose employees said he'd called much earlier, saying someone had died.
He called around 1 to 1:30 p.m. to rent the car, and according to his testimony, he found out about his girlfriend's death at 2:45 p.m.
And what's more, she alleged, Eric did not take delivery of the rental car himself. Someone else signed for it, she said. But then later, she said, Eric tried to persuade employees of the rental car company to cover for it.
They were asked by Eric Volt's employees to write a document stating that they had personally delivered the car and that they had seen Eric Volt's in Managua the day Doris was killed.
Eric Volt, she concluded, was caught in his own lies. There was physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, and critical eyewitness testimony placing Eric at the scene of the crime. All of that taken together appeared to give the prosecutor an ironclad case. Eric Volt, she concluded, brutally murdered his ex-girlfriend Doris Jimenez in a fit of jealous rage. There's no death penalty in Nicaragua, so the prosecutor asked for the maximum, 30 years in prison. But now it was time to hear Eric's side of the story. Finally, all those vicious accusations, those prosecution claims, would be put to rest. Eric's defense attorney was reputed to be one of the best in the land, and the ammunition he had to work with was unassailable, unbeatable.
Welcome back to Dateline on OWN. I'm Tamron Hall. Eric Voles, a young American living in Nicaragua, stands trial for a brutal murder he says he didn't commit. The people demand justice, and as prosecutors continue to lay out their case, the accused fights to prove his innocence. Once again, here's Keith Morrison.
Eric Voltz was in big trouble. Angry crowds milled around the courthouse. A national newspaper seemed determined to ensure the gringo didn't evade justice. And the evidence presented by the Nicaraguan prosecutor appeared overwhelming. They always say, look for the male, the boyfriend, the person who is pretty close, and you'll find your killer.
Yeah.
There was an eyewitness. There were suspicious scratches on his back, and allegations that Eric had been insanely jealous of Doris's new boyfriend, had threatened to kill her. It was, in a word, grim. Or was it? Eric's family had hired the best lawyer they could find, a man who'd once defended Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega. And he had excellent ammunition, a perfect alibi. Remember, the murder happened around 12:30 p.m. in San Juan del Sur, more than 2.5 hours drive from Managua.
The first question that the police asked me when I was interviewed the night of her murder was, Eric, where were you today from 8 o'clock in the morning until the time you received this phone call saying that Doris was dead? And the first answer out of my lips to the police was that I was in my office in Managua. He then asked, do you have witnesses that can, confirm this? Yes.
Eric testified that his housemaid woke him up that morning at his Managua apartment sometime before 9 a.m.
And then I immediately went into the office, probably around 9 o'clock. And, there was my creative director, my managerial editor, and my graphic designer.
All three provided testimony they had been with Eric, just as he claimed. But there was more. A potential business partner called. Respected Nicaraguan journalist Ricardo Castillo asked for a meeting to talk about Eric's magazine.
I called him at 10:30, 11 on the conventional line, not on the cell phone, because the meeting was set originally at 1, and then something else came up for me after 2. So I called him and asked him to move the meeting from 1 to 12. And he said yes.
Ricardo says he showed up at Eric's office at 12 noon on the dot.
Were there other people in the office that day?
Yes. There were at least 7 other people.
He was with Eric, he testified, from 12 noon until after 2 p.m. And about the time the murder happened, they were both on a conference call. At the other end of the call in Atlanta was American Nick Purdy, who testified that as they talked, he and Eric were exchanging instant computer messages. He submitted the time-stamped messages to the Nicaraguan court. Eric seemed perfectly fine and even upbeat that day, said Castillo.
Didn't seem nervous in any way?
Not that I noticed.
Not stressed?
Really, not at all, because then we had a very relaxed lunch afterwards.
Castillo and 9 other people testified Eric Volz was in Managua more than 2.5 hours drive from San Juan at the time of the murder. But why call for a rental car at 1 p.m., as the prosecutor claimed, if, as Eric testified, he only found out about the murder at 2:45 p.m.?
The answer to that is it's not true. We didn't call at 1 o'clock. My secretary called around 3 o'clock, and we actually have the phone registry record that dictates that.
There's been some dispute about that car because nobody at the rental car company saw you rent it.
Well, they actually did. They did see me. They testified saying they didn't.
Sure enough, Eric's signature is on the rental car payment slip. Then Eric's defense produced cell phone records to show that Eric drove from Managua to San Juan just when he said he did.
My defense did present what's called a triangulation registry that shows where the phone calls I was making, which antennas they were being directed through. And then it shows them gradually, the antennas which correlate with the route to San Juan del Sur.
That, then, was the alibi. But Eric also responded to the prosecution's claim that Doris left these scratches on his shoulder as he attacked her.
I've seen a photograph of them, and sure as heck looks like fingernail scratches.
And number one, you're not a specialist. To a lot of people, they look at it and they know that it's not nail scratches. Because if you look at the photograph, the skin is not torn.
But there was a perfectly good reason for the scratches, said Eric. Remember at the funeral, he was one of the 4 pallbearers?
And on the downhill side of my shoulder, you can see where the blood vessels are broken and bruised. And that's because I had the casket and it would fall down. And then I would readjust the casket. And that's why there's 2 or 3 different lines.
This video seemed to back up his story. As for that blood under Eric's fingernails, police couldn't even determine whose it was or what type, let alone where it came from. There was no DNA test on anything. And at the crime scene, argued the crack defense team, police found nothing at all linking Eric to the murder. Nothing.
They took blood samples, pubic hair samples, saliva samples, and hair samples of me, and none of it coincided with what little they did find at the crime scene.
As for a motive, jealousy, Eric admits he knew Doris was seeing someone else. But
I'm not a jealous person. What I felt was excitement. It was kind of a relief for me to know that she was kind of taking the pressure off me a little bit.
And finally, there was that eyewitness, Nelson Dangla, At trial, Dangla admitted he was an alcoholic and not exactly an upstanding citizen. In fact, police initially arrested him right after Doris's murder. He was given immunity for his testimony that he saw Eric at the crime scene.
They didn't have any evidence against me. So at the last minute, the prosecution, kind of struck a deal with Nelson Dangla.
Surely no one would believe Dangla when Eric's alibi was so watertight, backed up by credible witnesses, phone records, cell phone towers, the rental car signature.
When it came to trial, you probably thought, I'll get off. No problem. Because I've got all these alibi witnesses, right?
Yes.
In fact, Eric's defense was so solid that back in Nashville, Tennessee, his mom Maggie and stepdad Dane were making preparations to bring him home.
We're feeling more positive all the time, and literally with probably 20 minutes before the phone call came about the verdict, we were on the couch together on the computer looking for plane tickets to buy to fly Eric home.
Feeling tremendous relief at this point.
We had brought all his clothes home with us, and I'd washed them, and we had doctors prepared to see him, all sorts of things in line for him. And we just knew he was coming home.
Or was he?
Coming up, the phone rings in Nashville.
Jackie? And it was just ripped out from underneath us.
When Murder by the Sea continues. Returning to our story, the trial of an American man accused of a brutal murder in Nicaragua comes to a close, and as both sides anxiously await the verdict, tensions mount and violence spills out into the streets. Here again, Keith Morrison.
The whole center of the town was like, the eye of a hurricane, quiet. It was the height of drama.
From morning to night, the drama of Eric Voltz's three-day trial electrified this usually lazy provincial town in Nicaragua. Writer Tony D'Souza recorded it all as it reached its climax, and the mood on the street turned thick with menace.
All around the courthouse, 2-block radius, there were riot police in armor with tear gas guns and shields, clubs.
Then Eric arrived in a flak jacket, surrounded by his own security force.
Better weapons than the Nicaraguan military had.
Oh yeah, it all reinforced the idea that here was a rich, powerful gringo trying to buy his way out of justice.
And that made the angry mob see red.
Whenever the crowd would see that, that of course they would be flared up. Doris's mother would be out there shaking her fist. Whenever there was a break in the trial, she would run down the steps, go past the riot police line, get right in front of the crowd, and raise her fist, and they would yell at the police, "You're whores of the gringo. Let us through. The process is corrupt." And, she whipped everyone up.
Whipped them up so much, police fired warning shots into the air, clearly audible inside the tiny courtroom, just as the lawyers were trying to make their closing arguments, and the judge was considering Eric's guilt or innocence. But first, some preliminary rulings.
I was with him the whole day.
Remember that perfect alibi, all those witnesses who said they saw Eric in Managua? The judge threw it all out.
Did the 10 people who were physically with him during the time of the crime all like him so much that they were all willing to lie for someone who'd killed his girlfriend?
The judge ruled in effect that they were all lying to protect Eric, all of them, including that pillar of the community, Ricardo Castillo.
Any other country you would have cross-examined, the other 10 people, and if all of them would have been lying, somebody would have cracked, with a good cross-examination. So they didn't do that.
It got worse for Eric. The judge also threw out Eric's phone records. They only proved calls were made, she said, not who made them. She applied the same logic to the instant messages and those cell phone tower records. Those scratches on Eric's shoulder and back couldn't have been made by a casket, she decided. Doris must have scratched him. And Nelson Dangla, the witness who placed Eric at the crime scene, the judge agreed he was an alcoholic, but she did not take him for a liar.
Nelson Dangla, who at one time was also accused, later became principal witness for the prosecution. He's the only person who can put Eric Volz in San Juan at the time of the murder.
But that was enough. Enough for the judge to convict Eric Volz of rape and murder of the beautiful Doris Jimenez.
You know, the judge started reading her verdict, and I realized that she was charging me with murder. She had found me guilty.
At that very moment, Eric's mom and stepdad were waiting by the phone. A video camera shooting what they hoped would be a moment of elation.
I'm sorry, I just got a text from Simon. It's a guilty verdict.
Jackie.
We were just devastated. It was, you know, it was just the total antithesis of what we had been preparing ourselves for weeks and weeks.
It's a guilty verdict.
And I didn't know whether to pass out or throw up or kick something, just to overcome the absurdity of this.
Where they're getting ready to take Eric back to jail.
How could he have been found guilty?
It's absolutely opposed to the evidence.
Since the trial, Tony D'Souza has done his best to run down every testimony, every piece of evidence, any rumor. He has come to one conclusion.
Eric Volz could not have physically killed Doris Jimenez.
Simply could not have been there. And yet, here Eric was in prison, sentenced to 30 years, as was his co-defendant Chamorro. He immediately launched an appeal which, like him, seemed to fall into a big black hole. Eric was, quite simply, in hell, and his chances of ever getting out seemed to wither by the day.
Coming up.
No one from the government has called me to let me know what's going on with my son.
When Murder by the Sea continues. And now with the conclusion of Murder by the Sea, here's Keith Morrison.
30 years. Here. Surely the very definition of hard time. Eric says after authorities uncovered a plot to have him killed, he was transferred to the infamous Modelo prison and became a target for other inmates.
People tried to plant drugs in my cell. People tried to put, at one point, you know, weapons in my cell, and then they would go tell the guards. And they constantly were looking for a way to be able to justify sending me to solitary confinement block.
And as days became weeks and then months, Eric's promised appeal seemed to go nowhere.
You're not fighting this alone.
So Eric's family publicized his plight far and wide. A YouTube segment, a slick website, appearances on television.
You last saw your son on Friday. How is he holding up?
Which they hoped would pressure the Nicaraguan authorities. And all the while, Eric had no idea how long his descent into hell was going to last. His appeal had been expected for months. Would his case ever be reviewed?
Every time there was a delay in the appeal, it was like a stab in the heart. My life, I lived it, you know, in week-long blocks. And they would announce that they were going to, you know, present the resolution in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and nothing would happen. You know, it just twisted my guts and my heart. It hurt so bad to wait for these, you know, the delays were, it's undescribable.
And yet he did describe it, graphically, in his prison journal, which his family turned into a blog.
The best analogy I have come across for being locked up here is that it's like being buried alive. It's like having a cave collapse around you, leaving just enough room to breathe and touch your toes. At first you are shocked and terrified. Time and space come to mean something totally different than before.
4 months into his sentence, he was coming apart at the seams.
The noise is traumatic. It's like being in an industrial factory with metal doors slamming. 5 or more different kinds of music at full blast at the same time, and crazy inmates screaming at 4:30 a.m. just to be jerks and wake people up. At times it drives you nuts. I've been driven to the point where I have to sit down in my cell, cover my ears, and focus on my breathing just to keep it together.
Eric was struggling to keep it together physically too, on a meager diet of rice and beans.
The food is not enough. It is not uncommon to find cockroaches and fingernails in the rice. Yesterday, the doctor diagnosed me with gastritis and intestinal parasites for which I am now taking meds. My whole abdominal area aches. It's freaky being ill like this in prison.
Then, after a year in prison, finally, a ruling of innocence. He had won his appeal. And yet, for 5 days he waited, still in prison, as angry Nicaraguans turned their fury on those appeals judges, and the government ordered an investigation into how they reached their decision. His mom, Maggie, beyond frustration.
Why is he still in a prison?
Finally, in a sudden rush, Eric was released. But even then, he didn't know if he would get out of the country alive.
You had a group of people who were protecting you and getting you to an airport and getting a private plane that flew out of there fast.
It was a dangerous situation, and we had to take the necessary precautions.
You wore a bulletproof vest.
Yeah.
For good reason, probably.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
Finally, Eric arrived home in Nashville just before Christmas and into the arms of his mom.
I got my mom's back. It's the best Christmas present ever.
We were relentless. We weren't going to let go. We just fought as best we knew how.
When we left the last time, I remember thinking to myself, that guy's chances in there are not good. Here you are.
It's a miracle that I survived.
What was your state of mind in those dark days?
You have to become a warrior to survive those kind of situations. You know, those prisons are very dangerous. So you really do have to kind of adopt, you know, a stronger, harder demeanor.
Put on a kind of a brittle mask.
I don't know if it's a mask. It's real. You know, you got to do whatever you got to do to stay alive.
And coming out the other end of the tunnel, when did you feel free?
I still don't feel free. I'm out of prison and I'm out of Nicaragua, but they continue to persecute me. They're now threatening to throw the judges in jail that signed and ruled in my favor. My case is now being seen by the Supreme Court.
That means Eric's innocence could be put in doubt again, he says, while Doris's real murderer might be free to murder again.
There's a very good chance that I'll be considered a wanted man in Nicaragua and potentially in the Central American region, and that's not justice. I'm an innocent man, and that's not freedom.
But for now, he says, he is grateful to his family, to those appeals judges, to the soft bed waiting at home.
My first hot shower in, you know, over a year. I slept deeper than I think I've ever slept in my life. You know, the first night after I was a free man. You can't appreciate your freedom until you've had it taken away and you've had to fight to retrieve it.
Eric Volz petitioned the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in an attempt to prevent Nicaragua from reinstating his conviction. Volz has also written a memoir about his ordeal. That's all for this edition of Dateline on OWN. I'm Tamron Hall. Thank you for watching.